Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Surfer's Library. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legend. Today, we're going to be reading a book I recently picked up called Hansen, The Adventures of a Surfer, Skydiver, Team Roper, Entrepreneur, by Don Hansen with Chris Ahrens. At its core, Hansen is the life story of Don Hansen, a key figure in California surf culture and the founder of Hansen Surfboards. This book follows his journey from South Dakota to the California coast, which is a pretty wild origin story for a surfer, if you ask me. It tracks his rise during the golden era of surfboard manufacturing in the 1960s, covers his time surfing in Hawaii, including big waves and competition. It then goes beyond surfing into his other lives as a skydiver, team roper, and entrepreneur. I guess what I'm saying here is that it's not just a book about surfing, it's a multi-life adventure story. With all that said, today we're going to be reading Chapter 5, In the Shadow of Waimea, about his incredible year on the North Shore, where he challenged the biggest waves in the world and scored a coveted Surfer magazine cover. Let's paddle out with Don Hansen in Hawaii in the fall of 1960. Chapter 5, In the Shadow of Waimea. I arrived in Hawaii in the fall of 1960 after a 12-hour flight on pleasant Hawaiian holidays, flying out of San Francisco. Flying there and flying back, I kept wondering where all the gas was coming from to stay in the air that long. Seeing Oahu from the air for the first time was one of the most exciting points of my life at that time. It looked so peaceful and inviting from the air. Still, I knew it wasn't as tranquil as it appeared, and that I was about to be challenged by the biggest waves ever ridden at that time. Everyone was talking about these newly ridden spots, Waimea Bay and Pipeline. Upon landing, we noticed the humidity was suffocating, which was something we soon got used to. I didn't know famed Hawaiian surfer Sammy Lee at the time, but he remembers seeing me get off the plane. He was working at the airport then, and he told me years later they had seen me with a pregnant wife, 2 kids, and half a dozen surfboards. I had made the boards while working for O'Neill, and my plan was to sell most of them and live on whatever came in for the first few months. Lee said he wondered where the hell I was coming from and where could I possibly be going, and I kind of felt that way myself. After getting a ride to the mile of cars in Honolulu, we bought a 1946 Studebaker for about $300. Many visiting surfers lived in their cars back then. I wouldn't have minded that, but it was out of the question with 2 children and a pregnant wife. Like most everyone else visiting the North Shore from the mainland at the time, we lived somewhat primitively in whatever shelter we could find. We didn't have much that year, but this would become one of the most fun and adventurous periods of my life. Oahu was beautiful, but I wasn't there for the scenery. I was there for one reason, to ride the biggest waves I could find. I was determined to charge whatever came in, but I still wondered if I was up to the task. I don't recall where we stayed that first night, or if we had already reserved a place in Cavella Bay, which would be our home for the winter. Anyway, we ended up renting a place in Cavella Bay just north of Sunset Beach. The Kahuku Sugar Plantation owned these old plantation houses. I recall that the foreman who rented to me was named Morgan. I had called him up and asked if he would rent us one of his cabins. Without knowing anything else about me, he quickly agreed. The rent was $40 or $50 a month. If you didn't know where Cavella Bay was, you would not even know it was there. The area was overgrown, and you had to take a little dirt path to get in. Once you did, it was paradise. A few years ago, I was looking for the road again, and I asked a guy at his vegetable stand on Cam Highway where the entrance was. He showed me, and I drove down the dirt track to the place our family had once lived. Our house and all the other cottages were gone. Other than that, it was the same Eden it had always been. We first arrived there in fall, which is early for the big wave season. There weren't many guys surfing there yet, but it turned out that the surf would be excellent early that year. The only surf photographer around was surf filmmaker Grant Roloff. One of the first places I surfed was Chun's Reef, a Southern California type of wave. As I mentioned, I was always attracted to clear water, and it was so clear I could see down to the reef at Chun's all the way to the outside. Clear, warm water, uncrowded, perfect surf. I was in heaven. I had only been surfing for 4 or 5 years by then, and there were many better surfers than me in the islands at the time. I was in awe of my surroundings and would soon be in awe of how massive the waves could get at times. After a short while, our kids began looking like something out of Tom Sawyer, all tanned with sun bleached hair, never wearing shoes, shirts, or anything but shorts. I wasn't interested in fruit at the time, but there were all sorts of wild guava, breadfruit, and mangoes free for the taking. We lived on a lot of rice and lobster. There were some shallow spots in the middle of the bay where you could always count on getting enough lobsters for a meal. It was also legal to take turtles in those days, but I never got any of them. Two of the best divers I'd ever known, Neil Tobin and famed big wave surfer and deep water diver Jose Angel, came by one day and took me to another reef. It was really shallow for about a quarter mile before it dropped off into deep water. After we got chased out of the water by a big shark, we ended up swimming inside and hanging out in the shallow part of the reef. My car only broke down once when the rear end went out. Then my friend Neil Tobin, already on the North Shore, and I scoured the ditches along Cam Highway for abandoned cars. Neil was great at fixing cars, and when we found a junked Studebaker in a ditch on the side of the road that was similar to mine, we went to work. The vehicle we located was covered with dirt and weeds, and I'm not even sure it was the same year as mine. Still, we jacked it up right there and removed the needed parts while the locals drove by screaming out, "Hey, Howley!" Once we removed the rear end, we replaced it with the one from my car. It went just fine from then on, and I ended up driving that car every day for the remainder of that year without any more problems. Paradise Found. Tom Keck is a photographer and good friend of mine from Coronado. In 1960, he and John Elwell were going to school in Hawaii at Brigham Young University. Tom had rented one of these old plantation houses in Covella Bay near me, and he let me make surfboards in the garage attached to his place. He said he didn't want to leave his car in the garage because it was so dilapidated the roof might fall in and damage his car. Thanks, Tom. According to Keck, the place was so full of holes that there was foam dust flying around everywhere when Don was shaping. The houses had no windows, just screens and shutters so you could board everything up when it rained, as it so often does in the islands. You could barely call it a house, really, but it had everything we needed, including an inside toilet and a sink. Other than that, it consisted of one big bedroom and was just open. I was 26 years old at the time, and while not everyone would have liked living where we did, my wife Sharon and I loved it. Nikki was probably 4 or 5, and Bo was around 7 at the time. They were too young to surf over there, but they spent hours each day exploring the beach and shallow water near the reef. The founder of Surfer Magazine, John Severson, arrived sometime before Thanksgiving to take still photos for his magazine and to shoot film for his surf movies. He lived just down the road from us. We went to his house on Thanksgiving Day and I brought a turkey. He also had a turkey, but he served mine and kept his. Food was scarce in those days, especially with a wife and 2 hungry kids, and I was hoping to go home with some leftovers. John and I were friends, but that kind of irritated me for a while, especially since he had a lot more money than I did at the time. Like most everyone else who had migrated to the North Shore to surf, we were living on a shoestring. It didn't cost much to live, and I made a little something on my surfboards. Still, we needed a little more to survive. That was the only time in my life I collected unemployment. Severson made up for everything and more when he put me on the cover of Surfer magazine. I wasn't much of a small wave surfer, but being on the cover writing Haleiwa was a pleasant shock to me. There was very little surf media around in those days, and Surfer was the leading magazine. If you got your photo on the cover of Surfer magazine in those days, you were made. I was determined to surf whatever waves came through while many of the guys sat on the beach when it really got going. I understand that, and I can't blame them. It can be terrifying. I was scared at times, but I always tried to make it out, even though I had my heart in my throat a few times when I got stuck inside on big days at Sunset or Waimea. Keep in mind that they measure the wave from the back in Hawaii. So when what they call a 15 to 18-foot wave is dropping on your head, you're nothing. You quickly realize how small you are compared to the ocean that is trying to hammer you. You'd be out trying to get over to the channel when you spotted something coming in from way outside. Suddenly, there'd be this vast wave face about to break on you. Your adrenaline is pumping, and you have no choice then but to push your board away and dive as deep as you can. If you were lucky, your board made it over and there were no bigger waves coming in as you paddled out into the lineup. I had some shots of myself riding big waves in some of Roloff's movies. North Swell was the main one, and if you can find a copy, let me know. I'd love to see it again. Grant knew I was making surfboards, and he always did his best to help me out by getting me into his movies. When he aired the film, he'd give my business a plug, saying something like, "Here's Don Hansen riding one of his own surfboards." That really helped my business eventually. Tobin didn't board surf much, but he was a hell of a body surfer. He showed me some of the breaks, but I mostly learned them by watching for a while and figuring out where everything was in the lineup. From there, it was just paddling out, getting into position, and go. Going was not always that easy, especially at Waimea, which is a lot more challenging to ride than Sunset. For me, it was mostly a survival stance, and once you came out over the end of the wave, you breathed a sigh of relief that you had made another one. The worst part of it was the anticipation and wondering what might happen if you got caught inside. You knew the waves were going to be massive as you drove down Cam Highway to Waimea. Every other North Shore big wave spot like Sunset broke way out to sea and closed out, sometimes flooding the road with the surge. Once I got down to the beach, however, I knew I was going out there. I never did work out, but I surfed all the time, watched my diet a little, and I stayed in reasonable shape. I made a 10-foot, 6-inch elephant gun for a local surfer named Max Lim. I was in my mid-20s at the time, and he was around 60 and still riding big waves alongside us. He was a fantastic surfer and a really nice guy. Randy Rarick recently told someone he located that board and sold it at auction. He said the words on the stringer read, "Elephant Gun for Max Lim." I wish I would have known that board was for sale. I would have paid good money to get it back. There were some big days at Waimea that year, and one of the biggest compliments I ever had in surfing was after I came in from riding a big day. The waves were massive, and there were a bunch of guys sitting on the beach watching. As I walked by, one of the guys, Ricky Young, who was among the better surfers coming out of South Bay, said, "Well, Hansen, you rode some big waves today. You no longer have to prove yourself." I don't know about that, but I know that I have this habit of doing something as hard and as well as I can for a few years before moving on to the next challenge. I didn't quit surfing after that winter in Hawaii, but I was never again as into it as I was that year. There were other challenges ahead and other things I wanted to try. Greg Knoll may not have been the most stylish surfer in the world, but he sure looked good to me and he took off on anything. No wonder they call him the Bull. Some guys like Knoll don't seem to have any fear. They just aren't afraid. Like anyone who's lived life over the edge, the name of his biography, Greg has had some close calls. One was at Massive Makaha in 1969, where most agree he rode the biggest wave ever up to that time. Some guys die pushing the envelope that hard, and while surfing big waves can be an adrenaline rush and scary for sure, it's usually not life-threatening. Even so, I have no trouble admitting that everything from big wave surfing, skydiving, and team roping has scared the shit out of me at times. In surfing, I got to the point where I reached the peak of my own performance and thought, I don't have to do this anymore. Maybe it was as Young said, I no longer had to prove myself. Greg Knoll, Pat Curran, Dick Brewer, and Mike Doyle were some of California's standouts when it got big. Kimo Hollinger, Henry Priest, and Jose Angel were among the prominent locals. Angel was a fantastic surfer and diver, and I never heard him brag about anything he ever accomplished. If you lost your board, you had no choice but to swim for it. You hoped you weren't right in the kill zone where the waves could drive you to the bottom. That was the only thing I was afraid of. I always tried to get in further or out on the other side of it. The surf leash wouldn't be invented for another decade, and when you lost your board, you were in for a long swim, especially at sunset. When I lost my board there, I'd get into the reef where it was only about a foot or two deep. I must have had a lot of adrenaline running through me because once I got there, I'd run over that reef, cutting the shit out of my feet without really feeling it. That channel would be running like a river, and I'd make sure I was as far to the north as I could get before I dove in and swam like a son of a bitch for the other side. I'd pray I'd get in before the channel turned into a rip and headed out to sea. When someone got caught in that rip, they could be taken out 300 to 400 yards in like 5 minutes. Then you'd hear them yelling, "Help! Help!" If you didn't get your board right away, you'd have to go around again. Sometimes someone's board would get swept out to sea and the owner would ask you to go get it. Not a chance. I never did any training for big surf, but having surfed in Santa Cruz for 2 years, I was used to being in some pretty big waves. Even though Santa Cruz waves didn't have Sunset's power, There were other challenges to face. At Steamer Lane, you had to deal with the cold water, thick kelp, sea lions barking at you, and the ominous sound of foghorns. The water in Hawaii was warm and clear, so the surf size never bothered me that much initially. It wasn't until later when you realized how powerful some of those waves were that it kind of scared you. You were a little bit of nothing out there. You can't hang on to your board. A big enough wave will rip it out of your hands. If you're smart, you push it away and swim. I was in the best shape of my life, and I was a decent swimmer, so I knew I could always get in. The ocean was not the only place you might face danger in Hawaii. You could find it just as quickly on land. I always figured you needed someone to protect you when you were on the North Shore, and Henry Priest was my primary protector over there. He was such a great guy. I'd be out drinking with the guys, and by the end of the night, after the local boys had a few, you were a haole. Whenever one of the Hawaiians would say something about me being haole, I wouldn't respond, but Henry would jump in and say, "Leave him alone, he's my brother." I always stayed in my place around the Hawaiians. I was very aware that it was their island, and I gave them the respect they deserved. Even so, sometimes after a few drinks, you could instantly become the haole. Henry saved me more than once. I also made sure to be friends with Rabbit Kakai and Buffalo Kealana. They were like royalty, like Hawaiian chiefs, and everybody respected them. If you wanted to surf Makaha, you needed to know Buffalo. Rabbit is gone, but he and Buffalo were among Hawaii's greatest surfers, and there's so much respect for them in the surfing world. Many years after my first trip to the islands, I sent my son Josh there. He was young, and some guys began hassling him in the lineup. I called Rabbit and told him about it, and he said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." That was the end of that. The Hawaiians didn't come over to the North Shore much in those days. I don't think they were as serious or as competitive as the mainland surfers were. While they were mostly naturally gifted surfers, most of them surfed merely for the joy of it. Some of them claimed they were the first to ride pipeline. Maybe so, but it's hard to imagine riding that place with ancient surfboards. If you didn't live right on the beach, the only way to know the surf was huge was when you felt the ground vibrating. Then I'd think, shit, now I gotta go down to Waimea and paddle out. I always went out, and I got some big waves there a couple times. Still, you have some anxiety attacks. A typical day at sunset, at least for me, was riding 4 or 5 waves. It's a long way out and a lot of paddling. After 4 or 5 waves, I'd be done. The scariest part there is when the peak shifts and you're about to have a big wave break on you. Then you find yourself scrambling to get up and over the top. If you don't make it, it's a long trip over the falls. I never did get sucked over the falls, but there were times when I was paddling for a wave and I got sucked back up into the crest with the offshore wind blowing into my face. I wasn't always sure I was going to make the drop or not, but to my recollection, I always did. One morning I awoke to feel the ground shaking, and I knew the surf was really big. There'd been a party the night before. I had a terrible hangover, and I thought, if I have to surf today, I'm going to die. But true to the promise I had made myself, I loaded up my board and drove to the pipeline. I had never seen pipe that big, and I can still envision Greg Knoll standing there when John Severson took what would become one of the most famous surfing photos of all time. Greg was contemplating how to get out, standing alone with his board leaning against his shoulder as the waves roared in front of him. The photo was taken just before he paddled out and rode what was probably the biggest surf ever ridden at Pipeline to that point. I may have been too hungover because I had always been able to get out before. However, this time, each time I tried to paddle out, I ended up way down the beach. After my third time getting washed down the beach, I watched a couple of massive waves come through. I thought, do I really want to go out there? That was the only time I backed out. In surf that size, you got to know when to say no unless you want to die. I eventually did surf Pipeline on some smaller days. It can be dangerous, but almost everyone survives. Still, once in a while, someone will die trying. The waves they're riding now are far more dangerous than they were then, like the one woman who rode a massive wave in Nazaré, Portugal. They say it was the biggest wave ridden that year and that it measured 75 to 80 feet. That's hard to imagine because if that thing really steepened up and came over on you, it could kill you. When you're out there on a big day, you realize the ocean can eat you alive. The only photo I have on a big day is at sunset on one of the smaller days that year. Judy Roloff, Grant's wife, took the shot. It measures out a lot bigger from the face, But if you consider it from the back the way they do in Hawaii, they probably only call it around 12 feet. To my knowledge, 1960 was the first year some of the Aussies showed up in Hawaii. Mick McMahon, Midget Farley, maybe Nat Young, and some other Australians whose names I've forgotten lived just down the street from us. They were all great surfers, and it was fun talking to them about their homeland. They would pave the way for those who came later and would eventually make their names in Hawaii. Back then, however, they were just getting started. When you're in the lineup on a big day, the first person to see the set coming starts paddling out, and you think, oh shit, I gotta get out of here fast or else. You're racing to make it, and when you finally paddle into the right spot and take off just right, it's very satisfying. When you see that wave coming, you want to make sure you're in the right place to drop into it. You can't be too far in or too far out. Once you start paddling, you quickly discover if you're in the correct position or not. There were board builders in Hawaii since ancient times, but by the time I got there, I looked to see what top shapers like Pat Curran, Joe Quigg, and George Downing were doing. It was just that much more exhilarating riding a board you made. I was probably making a board a week for a while. When you create boards for big waves, you need to have confidence in them. Either that or you'll be swimming all the time. I had confidence in my boards. They were long and narrow and heavy enough, and I knew they would work in any conditions. I was building about one board a week, even though it wasn't that profitable, and I brought in less than $100 a week. Even back then, that wasn't sufficient for a family of 4, which was soon to be 5. That's okay. No amount of money could buy what we had. Greg de Bull Knoll is ranked among the greatest big wave pioneers of all time and Hansen's close friend. According to Greg Knoll, I first became aware of Don Hansen while surfing Haleiwa with Bruce Brown and many of the North Shore crew that year. He was a good surfer, not like Phil Edwards. Still, he could surf, especially for having come from South Dakota or Cucamonga or some shit. He became part of our group right away. Some guys never make it. Some guys kind of teeter, and some guys fit in. Hansen was one that fit right in. When I got to know him, I realized he was a really neat guy, and I would now put him in the top 10 of my really good friends. Don paid a lot of attention to detail when he made surfboards. He prided himself on knowing everything that was going on. Once, however, after we returned from the islands, Australian Bob McTavish had introduced the world to shortboards. I got an order from Charlie Galento, big wave charger and Knoll shop manager in Hawaii, for 150 shortboards. They were little tiny boards all around 7 feet in a time when boards averaged around 10 feet in length. Hansen came by to visit and he wanted to have lunch. He kept heading for the door of the factory and I'd block him off. Finally, the telephone rang and he got by me, and I heard this, "Holy shit, what's going on?" There were like 75 racks with all these shortboards in them. That was the first time I ever saw him caught with his shorts down. It was neat to catch him unaware. Hansen and I were in Puerto Rico for the World Contest in 1968. We went out and got drunk together, and he stuck his tongue out at me. I reached over, grabbed his tongue, and held on really tight. He was squealing like a pig. All he had to do was chomp down and bite my hand, and I would have let go, but he didn't, and I hung on. He was a bit of a goody two-shoes, and my friends and I were kind of scum of the earth, but somehow we became great friends. All I can say is good shit about Don. Just tell him not to stick his tongue out at me anymore. In the end, all I can say is that the world's a better place because of Don Hansen. Well, I do believe that is going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed this chapter as much as I did. I really had no idea Don had lived so many lives in his 89 years. Very impressive. There's so many stories in this book, so I promise we will be coming back to this book in the future. If you enjoyed this story, please consider sharing the podcast with a friend who loves surfing, surf culture, or just a good story from the past. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/The Surfer's Library. Your support helps cover the platform fees that keep the show going each month, so any little bit helps. Also, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast or have any story ideas or feedback, please contact me on Instagram or at thesurferslibrary@gmail.com. With all that said, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, Keep your toes on the nose, your stoke high, and always, always, always support your local surf shop. I'll see you out in the lineup. Chris Ahrens is a prolific surf writer, storyteller, and ocean historian based in Southern California. He's been writing for surfing magazines for over 30 years, contributing to every major surfing publication in the world. Among his books are Good Things Love Water, Joyrides, Surf Stories, Volume 2, and Kalea's Gift, Surf Stories, all of which collect his essays, retold legends, and experiences from decades of surfing. His most recent book is Wind and Sea, Life, Death, Resurrection, a 155-page tome chronicling the history, culture, and characters of the Wind and Sea reef break in La Jolla from the 1930s through the 1980s. Ahrens also has experience beyond print. He was editor-in-chief of Risen magazine for 7 years, wrote and directed the documentary Dope, Death of Prison Eventually, and has co-written the memoirs of skateboarder Christian Hosoi. He lives in Cardiff by the Sea, California with his wife Tracy and their cats. Surfing in the ocean remains central to his life. To learn more, visit his website, paralandrapublishingcompany.com.